The science of classifying living things is called taxonomy. And the categories that we use are called taxa for singular and taxon for plural. Again, those are classification category. Okay, the most inclusive one, the one with the most different groups under it, is the domain. I call it a super kingdom, but no one else does. Okay, under the domain, the next most inclusive taxa is kingdoms. There's 5 kingdoms. We'll talk about this later. Each kingdom has a bunch of phylums under that fall under it. Then each phylum has a bunch of classes under it, etc. Order, family, genus, species. Species is the most exclusive taxa. A species compared to a domain contains only a certain type. Not a whole bunch of things are included in there. Only the ones that can reproduce with themselves and have offspring, produce offspring. So we go from the most inclusive to the most exclusive. I could say the most inclusive is the most general, and the most specific is the most exclusive category. The categories that a living thing fit into, all the way from domain to species, is like an address for the organism. So just to give a analogy, the domain would be like the country that you're in. Kingdom would be like your maybe the state. Then on all the way to species. Species would be your home address. And between state and your home address, there's all kinds of subdivisions or subcategories. So in your state, it could be the southern part of your state, southeastern part of the state, and then it could be your county or your voting precinct, and then your voting precinct, and then your neighborhood, and then your street, and then your specific address. Okay, it's like that. And I guess they just showed this right here. I forgot to say your city. Okay, you don't have to know that. It just makes it, the person's like the organism. And the species is the home address, street. Okay, so you get the idea. So it goes from, when you go from domain to species, the members in the domain have less in common. So this is more inclusive. It includes more different types whereas more specific is exclusive. They only want certain types. So I like this idea of having more in common. If you have more in common with other things in your taxa, then the category that you share with those organisms is closer to the species end. And if you have less in common with, generally, with the organisms in a category, then that category is closer to the kingdom end. Okay, you might want a mnemonic device for remembering the order from the most general to the most specific taxa. So I think of this one. Do keep pots or pans clean, or family will get sick, or just get sick. Do keep pots clean, or family gets sick. So, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, it's already family, genus, and species. So, which of these has the most in common? That would be down towards the bottom. The most exclusive. The ones that have the most in common. So, which one's lower to the bottom? That would be, let's just find them. Order, class, phylum, kingdom. So of the four they gave me, order is the answer. So the least in common would be the most inclusive. So that would be closer to domain. So do keep pots clean. So which one's closer? There's no domain. Is there a kingdom? Yes. Below. Okay, this is our address, our taxonomic address. So we are in domain eukarya. Do keep pots clean, or family gets sick. Identify the highlighted taxa, so that'd be kingdom and family. Okay, so do keep pots clean, or family gets sick. So phylum and genus. Okay, our scientific name, when instead of giving the whole address of an organism, scientists just refer to the genus and species. So instead of me saying I live in the United States, in Florida, in Pinellas County, in Dunedin, at Marjan Avenue at the house with the 736 number on it. Instead of me saying that, I just say, hey, I live in 736 Marjan, Dunedin. And so it's just the genus and species name. So we're Homo sapiens, which means wise man. When scientists are referring to a specific organism, the type that organism is compared to other ones, they generally use a system called binomial nomenclature instead of all the taxons. They just use the genus and species. So for us, they would call us, when they refer to a human, a modern human, they would say Homo sapiens. And it's assumed that they're mammals, and you could look it up, all the other taxon up. But, for example, a dog would be Canis familiaris, genus and species name. So that's called binomial nomenclature, when you just use the genus and species to identify something. And binomial means two. Nomio means name. Nomenclature is a naming system. Okay, grab this from the first page, I think, of the study guide, which I skipped. So this guy, Linnaeus, came up with this binomial nomenclature technique of just the species and the genus followed by the species name. Now notice that the genus name is capitalized and the species name is lowercase. And usually we try to keep it italicized, slanted like that. Now here I just mentioned these three things, but this is kind of weird. I call the scientific name the genus and species, but if you notice on the previous page, they call species the species epithet. And then they when they put together the genus and species, they called that the species name, which is kind of weird. So I just call it the scientific name. That's how I learned it. Okay, so genus. So how do we write the species name, which I call the scientific name of American black bears? Well, you capitalize the first of all, it has to be slanted, italicized. You capitalize the genus, and you lowercase the species. What is a tiger's genus? The first one that's capitalized. Okay, so phylogeny is the evolutionary relationships between different taxa. And we talked about that when we talked about evolution and the phylogenetic tree, as you recall. Like these two guys share a common ancestor here. These two guys share a common ancestor here, etc. Cladistics deals, that thing is called a phylogenetic tree. Cladistics is looks more like something like this. We'll talk about that It's a cladogram. We'll get into this more, of course, but a cladogram shows the characteristics that different taxon share. And you'll see what I mean as we go on. So here's phylogenetic tree, at least part of a phylogenetic tree. And we can say that the mouse and us have more of a recent common ancestor than a kangaroo and us, and etc. So wherever there's branching, there's a common ancestor, right? Now this looks like a cladogram that I just gave you, but there's no traits, there's no characteristics listed, so it's not a cladogram. Now, since I already pretty well explained phylogenetic trees in evolution when we did that unit, we're not going to rehash it. So we're going to skip past the next few pages in the study guide until we get to cladograms. So just to kind of review a little bit, phylogenetic trees, these are different types of humans. Really, we're the only human. Homo sapiens is the only one that exists today. The other ones went extinct. Okay, so the question is, identify the node. The node is the place where the tree branches, where two branches come out of what was one. Identify the node that represents the last common ancestor. That means I don't say the last, I say the most recent common ancestor of Homo sapiens, Homo Neanderthal man, and Heidelbergen man. So here's Homo sapiens, I already circled. Here's Homo neanderthalensis, and here's Homo heidelbergensis. Okay, so all you do is you keep on going down until the tree. Keep on going down the tree until you all combine at the same place. Okay, so if I said, what is the common ancestor, most recent common ancestor of H. sapiens and H. neanderthalensis, you say D. But we have to include this guy. So we're going to take it down. Here's where these all intersect. So it's really, B is the most recent ancestor of the three circled ones. Again, this is a phylogenetic tree. And we already should have been able to do that in the evolution chapter. Now, a cladogram looks like a phylogenetic tree, but it adds something. What it adds is characteristics, traits. Okay, so the way you read a cladogram is that when they give you a characteristics, only the categories that go past that characteristic have that characteristic. So only domestic cats of all these things have the ability to purr. So how about having hair? Well, everything, let's see, everything, if you follow the main branch, everything past that has hair. But turtles aren't. Turtles were before that cat, even though it's bent like that. The turtles, really, if you follow it back, come before the category that had hair. So that's how you read a cladogram. Carnivores, that would only include everything past this point. So only these are carnivores. Okay, so everything past the characteristics that's written, those branches that go beyond it have that characteristic, but if you're a taxa that's before that category, then you don't have that characteristic. Okay, this is the easier to read version of a cladogram. This is the one I'll give you on quizzes and tests. Okay, so let's just see. So if I asked you who have this characteristic of carnivores, everything past it has it. Wolf, leopard, and cat. Now, does that mean a wolf has retractable claws and can purr? No, because it comes after him. Those characteristics come on the cladogram past where he sprouts out. So, where do we get the word cladogram? Well, a clad, as they state here, all the organisms believed to have evolved from a common ancestor. I should say common recent ancestor, including the common ancestor. So here's a clad right here. There's the common ancestor. And they both have the built retractable claws. I don't know, the green should cover this. The green should contain the characteristic, that green clad. Okay, and then this guy does include this yellow one is another clad with a recent ancestor that was more in the past. So everything in yellow, including the common ancestor and its characteristic, would be another clad. And they did the horse one correct. So the ones with hair have a common ancestor here, and that would be yet another clad. So that clad 1, clad 2, and clad 3. Here's another phylogenetic tree review question. Which of the following pairs are most closely related? Well, the ones that share a common ancestor. So, let's see. And also these also, but they don't include that. Let's see the other ones that they have. Personata, Negrinus. Okay, these aren't closely related. They are, but their common ancestor is right there, closer to the past. The past is that way, to the left. So Swinderner, Kina. Okay, these two guys, their common ancestor is way over here. Wait, no, right there is their common ancestor. So that's way to the left. So they're not very closely related. Then fish area FR, this guy, and okay, where's their common ancestor? No, well, okay, right there is their common ancestor, close to the left, so that's not very recent. So which ones are most closely related? The ones that branch off, that speciated, the closest to the present time. I would change this question to say, which of the following pairs have the most recent common ancestor? And therefore, if they have the most recent common ancestor, they're very similar. They're closely related. Okay, I wish they had put this kind of phylogenetic tree in more of an easier way to look at it. So, who shares the greatest number of derived characteristics? Well, it'd be the ones over here, because this guy has all these characteristics, and this guy has all those characteristics plus an extra one right there. So you pick two that are the most recent, and that would be just like the way we answered the other question. So it would be these guys. So to answer this question, which is opposite of the previous one, you would pick the ones that are least related, have the most spread apart in time common ancestor. So it'd be either one of these compared to like a really early one. Okay, so they share a common ancestor here, but then these guys, those two share a common ancestor with him way over here. So I'd pick either that guy or that guy compared to these two up here. Okay, so let's find it. Nigri. No, those are Nigri. I don't even have. Okay, here's Nigri. Then here's personnel. Well, they're kind of. Those are two common ancestors that are apart. But let's look at one that's further apart. Nigri. And no, it can't be that one, because they're right. They have a most recent common ancestor, which is recent. Okay, Swind and Tar. Tar and Swin. Whoa. Tar and Swin. They share a common ancestor. Let's see, Tar. Yeah, that's further apart than these two. Those two are further apart, so far maybe that's it. F and Rose. Okay, this guy and Rose. That, not so far apart. So I think the answer would be C. Because their common ancestors are further apart on the cladogram. Again, it would have been easier if they had set it up like that. Okay, I really didn't talk about the out group, but the out group is the one that's closest to the most distant common ancestor. So that would be that guy right there. He never really branched into all these. So he's called the out group. Okay, so here you're going to practice your table reading skills. So, which species is most closely related to the leopard? Well, let's find the leopard first. Okay, so the leopard has all these characteristics because if it's colored, it has that characteristics. If it's white, it doesn't have it. So we assume that the species that's most closely related to the leopard shares the most characteristics that the leopard has. So in this group that they give me, it looks like the turtle shares 4 out of the 5 characteristics, but the other ones share less. So I can't see a turtle and leopard being very similar, but based on these characteristics, the turtle and leopard will share the most recent common ancestor. So this one, which character was the last to merge? And that's kind of confusing if you don't think about it. The last one to merge is the most recent. And it's a characteristic that the other guys don't have. So we see the leopard has this that the other ones didn't. We're assuming that these guys evolved in that order. You can't go by that alone, but that's what a cladogram is showing. So the last thing that the other ones don't have characteristic is hair, but I don't see that in the choices, so I'd have to go with the next one, which is the shelled egg, or egg with amniotic fluid. Now you might say, hey, leopards don't have eggs. Well, they have like us, they have amniotic fluid in the sac where the fetus grows. So it's like an egg protected by the body of the mother rather than a shell. So amnion would be the choice since hair isn't there. Okay, so we're going to practice our table reading skills again. So which category is most closely related to the primate category? Okay, so where's the primates? That's the first thing I do, right there. Okay, so here's the characteristics along the top and down vertically. On the y-axis, it's not really a graph, but it's like the y-axis. In the columns, we have the taxa. So, which taxon? It's just that which taxa is most closely related to primates, since that's singular. Anyway, that's not important. So, primates have all these characteristics, and the ones that look like they have the same characteristics or close to the same characteristics on this table would be rodents and rabbits. So they're the most closely related to us according to the shared characteristics. Okay, so we already did this. But just to review, there's 3 domains. There's the eubacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya, or eukaryota. Okay, so these guys together are the prokaryotes, which isn't really a kingdom or a domain. And then eukaryote is obviously the domain name as well. But prokaryotes isn't a domain name. So the 3 domains are the ones I circled. Okay, this acronym means last universal common ancestor. And it's really confusing that they say it's the last. I would say it's the first, or the, yeah, because earliest. The earliest universal common ancestor was the first, is the common ancestor of all living things. So if you look at that tree of life that you just saw, with this is Luca. I call that the first common ancestor. But I guess if you're going back in time, it would be the last. That doesn't jive with me very well. So here's the simplest picture of the 3 domains: eubacteria, eukaryotes, and archaea. So we can see that the Luca is down here. The last universal common ancestor, and we're more closely related to archaea than we are to bacteria. Looks like bacteria, though, were the first to develop, to evolve from whatever Luca was. Now, domain eukaryotes are broken up into 4 kingdoms. This is important. We'll go into each of those coming up. So we got the fungi, we got protists, we got plants and animals. So those are the 4 types of eukaryotic kingdoms. So we should know this already. Comparing the characteristics of the 3 domains. Unicellular. They exist as one-cell organisms. Yeah, the prokaryotes do. Only unicellular. Eukaryotes, most are multicellular, such as us. We can't exist as one cell. But there's pretty many eukaryotes that are unicellular, like an amoeba or a yeast cell. Those are single-celled organisms. Okay, membrane, lipids. All cells have cell membranes. They're slightly different between the 3 categories, the 3 domains, but let's not make a big deal about that. Cell walls. Bacteria, eubacteria, yes, they have peptidoglycan as the main ingredient. Archaea, they don't have that in their cell wall, but they do have cell walls. For eukaryotes, if you're a plant, yes, you have a cell wall, and it's made of cellulose. If you're fungi, you have a cell wall made of chitin. Okay, it's like a polysaccharide with protein connected to it. Okay, so do they have a nuclear envelope? Well, nuclear membrane. Well, if they don't have a nucleus, they should say does it have a nucleus? So no, bacteria doesn't. Archaea, prokaryotes, they don't have it. But of course, eukaryotes have a cell nucleus, and that nucleus is there because of the nuclear membrane around it. Do they have membrane-bound organelles? Okay, like mitochondria, Golgi, all that. Besides the nucleus, no. For the prokaryotes, yes, of course, for eukaryotes. No, I should say ribosomes. Do they have ribosomes? Ribosomes are not surrounded by a membrane. So, yes, everyone has ribosomes. To which domain do we belong? Obviously, eukaryotes. Which domain has the four kingdoms? That would be eukaryotes. Okay, look at this phylogenetic kind of tree. Pretty cool. It's showing that the eukaryotes started with kingdom Protista first. And then Protista evolved into the fungi and animal, and maybe into the plants as well. So this is still kind of a theory based on shared characteristics. And Protista derived from, so Protista was the first eukaryotic cell. And it derived from a bacterial cell that maybe lives symbiotically with an RK cell. And the bacteria cell became like an organelle, like a chloroplast or a mitochondria in the first eukaryotic cell. Anyway, so Protista is one of the weirdest kingdom because it has plant-like, fungi-like, and animal-like members in it. You know, an amoeba is a single-cell protist that creeps around looking for food and engulfing it. That's a very animal-like protist. Then we have protists that are photosynthetic, like algae cells, and phytoplankton is made up of that. And those would be plant-like protists because they can photosynthesize. Then there's fungi-like protists because they put up little mushroom-like things with spores, which we'll talk about when we get to fungi. So protist is a very diverse kingdom. So we call animal-like protists, we call them protozoans because think of zoo. That's where the animals are. Proto means primitive. Okay, so right here is the amoeba that we talked about. And then the fungus-like one, you see these in Florida sometimes, northern Florida more. It's slimy. It puts up spores like mold. That's a fungus-like protist. The algae right here have chloroplasts. Here's an algae cell too. It's really a diatom, which is a type of, it's phytoplankton. It's this free-floating, single-cell stuff that is photosynthetic. in the ocean and the ponds. Euglena is an example of a plant-like protozoan as well. You can see the chloroplast in it. So the plant kingdom, all of them are multicellular. All plants are multicellular. Of course, they're photosynthetic, so they're autotrophs. Now, don't get algae mixed up with plants. Algae does photosynthesis, but algae can be single-celled or it can be multi-celled, but it doesn't have the what we call vascular tissue that plants have. Well, most plants have them. Primitive plants don't, but we'll get into that. So plants can have vascular tissue that's transport tissue. They're tubes that transport water and nutrients and minerals from the soil. Now, some plants are aquatic, like lily pads, but algae is not a plant. Algae does not have structures that support it. These vessels for transport. Some primitive plants, they don't really have specialized tissues that form tubes that transport the water and minerals and nutrients because they're so short. But obviously, they're not algae. They have structures that look like miniature plants. So the vascular plants are the cone-bearing plants, like pine trees. They're called conifers. Ferns, and flowering plants. So those are three categories of vascular plants. And then we have the non-vascular plants that are the mosses. Kingdom animal. Of course, they're all eukaryotic. They're all heterotrophs. Of course, they can't make their own food. They're heterotrophs like fungi. Of course, they're all multicellular. We're not going to really talk about all the different phyla of animals because that would take way too long. Here's a more conservative phylogenetic tree. So really, this, whatever was here, was very similar to a protist. And then the protist types evolved from that. So they didn't show that like they showed it in the other picture, that the other phylogenetic tree where these two merged together to form an early protist. And then the protist broke up into fungi, plantae, and animals in the current protist. Okay, so to which kingdom does Homo sapiens belong? Obviously, we're animals. Hey, what kingdom have multicellular species? Protists? Yeah, they do, but not all of them are multicellular. Think of kelp, which is an algae, which is a type of protist. It's huge. taller than trees even. But they live in the water. Plantae. Yeah, they're multicellular. All of them are multicellular animals. All are multicellular. So, letter D. Which kingdoms are only autotrophic? That means they produce their own food. That means photosynthetic. So that would be plants. Now some protists are autotrophic. That would be the plant-like protists, but they're not exclusively autotrophic. Okay, the plant kingdom is broken down into 12 phylums. We're not going to get into every detail. Let's just be kind of general. We have non-vascular plants. And these are the most primitive ones, obviously. And we'll just mention the mosses. These kind of plants are very small, very short. They don't have the tubes to bring water up to the leaves. They don't even really have leaves. They have little leaflet-like things. We'll talk about mosses in more detail, but so basically they remain small because they don't have these blood vessels that can turn into actually wood as well and support them as they get taller and taller. So mosses don't have that. Then there's the vascular plants, which are most of the phylum that make up plants. So vascular tissue, we'll talk more about that, but those are the tubes that transport water, nutrients, and minerals. Now, the more primitive vascular plants don't form seeds. So how do they reproduce? We'll talk about that. And we'll just know that those would be the those would be the ferns. Ferns do not produce seeds. You need a cone or a flower to produce seeds. So, first came mosses evolutionarily. Then came the vascular non-seed plants. And then came probably the cone plants, because the conifers, the plants that make seeds in cones, which are not as efficient as making seeds in flowers. Okay, but anyway, conifers are like pine trees. They bear cones, and the cones is where the seed develops in. And the final type of vascular plant is probably the most diverse and most successful one. It's the most recent one, evolution-wise, and that would be the plants that make seeds by flowers. Okay, so here's some other weird non-vascular plants, but mosses. I've never seen them grow that big here. In Georgia, I see that, but not in Florida. They stay kind of stunted and small. These are still kind of small, but much more lush than the ones in Florida. So most primitive plants evolved from algae. Algae doesn't need vascular tissue because they're surrounded by water. They're buoyed up sometimes by air pockets so that they can get to the light. But when you're a land plant, you have to be like moss, either close to the ground, so when it rains, you can have that water diffuse into you. Or if you're going to be a bigger plant, you're going to need vascular tissue to bring that water up so you can grow tall and get your leaves up there above other plants so you can photosynthesize. So some of those vessels, vascular tissue vessels, will turn into wood that will let you support yourself and not flop over. So there's two kinds of vascular tissues. There's xylem and phloem. The xylem transports water and minerals in the water that were in the soil from the roots to the stem to the rest of the leaves. And phloem transports glucose in water from the leaves to the stem where it's stored, or the roots. Sometimes the glucose is stored in the roots or the flower to make the fruit. So phloem transports that sugar water, which we call sap. And xylem transport water and minerals up from the root. Okay, so here's a microscopic picture, cross-section of a stem, and you can see different kinds of vessels. These are cells that store starch. Okay? They're not vascular tissues, they're just cells. These guys are actually long. These vessels are long tubular cells that die and form these tubes. So right here are the xylem, the big tubes for the water. All these little other tubes are, all those little ones are the phloem. Okay, so one of those bundles is right here in the stem. And that storage tissue is called pith. Like I said before, vascular tissue allows the plant to grow higher and taller so that it can put its leaves out in the sun instead of being overshadowed by other plants competing for the sunlight. Okay, this is a picture of club moss, which really isn't a moss at all. It grows taller than mosses. It looks like a moss, but it has vascular tissue and it can grow taller. So ferns and club mosses, you don't have to know. But ferns are vascular plants that you should know that don't form seeds. So there's two kinds of vascular plants. The one that don't form seeds, those would be like the ferns. And the ones that form seeds, of the seeded plants that form seeds are two types. The flowering plants, called angiosperms, the gymnosperms that bear cones, the seeds form in a cone rather than in a fruit that a flower forms. Now, seeds are an adaptation, and that's why angiosperms are so successful. They protect the plant embryo and give it a little food source until it's ready to germinate. So once again, gymnosperms, most of them are conifers. The seeds form on the cones, and flowering plants, the angiosperms, the seeds form in the fruit, which is derived from the flower. So angiosperms, because they so efficiently makes that seed, they dominate the plant species on the land. They're the best adapted and the most diverse of any phylum of plants. And our food comes from angiosperms like corn, wheat, or crops come from angiosperms. Now, there's two types of angiosperms, monocots and dicots. Those are classes. Again, you don't need to know their classes, but so how do you distinguish between monocots and dicots? Monocots have, when they germinate, you have only one that's monocotyledon. Now, the cotyledon is the organ that feeds the embryo in the seed, the food that's stored in the seed. That food is called endosperm. The cotyledon or cotyledons are the first leaf that a plant has. And they're in the seed, and they act, like I said, to feed the embryo as it grows. When the seed germinates, a monocot only has one cotyledon, and it's a spiky little thing like that. And a dicot seed, when it germinates, has these two cotyledons. Again, cotyledons are the first leaves that appear on the embryo. And you can, if you split a seed open, you can see it. Not green, but you can see their shapes in there. Okay, so other things. So look at these plants, grasses. These are all monocots in the flowers. Okay, so palm trees are monocots. Let's talk about some other characteristics of monocots besides having just one cotyledon. Before we do that, let's look at some dicots. Again, they have flowers. And all trees that aren't palm trees or pine trees, they would be dicots as well. So let's first compare the seeds. We see one cotyledon when we split a monocot seed. We see two cotyledons if we split a dicot seed. Also, if you look at the leaves, you can tell a monocot from a dicot angiosperm. So if you have the veins are branched, okay, the veins being the vascular tissue, that would be a dicot leaf. If as you can see here, if the veins, the vascular tissue is parallel in the leaf, then you have a monocot. So that's an easy way to distinguish between monocots and dicots. The stems, if you cut the stem and make a real thin slice and look at it under a microscope, monocots have their vascular bundles scattered throughout the stem, whereas dicots have the vascular bundles in a ring around the outer part of the stem, inside the stem, but along the close to the outside of the plant. And then all the rest is pith, storage for glucose and starch, whereas the vascular bundles are scattered throughout the whole stem in monocots. Here's a cladogram showing plant evolution. The common ancestor of the plants was a green algae, and that some green algae started protecting their embryos instead of just spewing out the gametes. Yeah, plants have gametes. But algae just spews out the gametes into the water. They fertilize and form an embryo plant. But the embryo started being protected because as algae became more used to living in damp parts of the ground, they realized that to prevent drying out of the embryo, they need to protect it in their body. And then mosses, non-vascular plants were the first things to come about. Liverworts are primitive, more primitive than mosses, but they're non-vascular plants too. Let's just stick with mosses. So the vascular system developed so that the plants could grow taller and support themselves. That became the ferns. Ferns that mosses do not form seeds, but the embryo is protected in the body of the parent. But it grows out of the parent. It's not protected in a seed that can go off somewhere else, be dispersed somewhere else, and not compete with the parent when it germinates and grows. So that's a good thing about the seed, is that it can be transported somewhere else. Okay, so the primitive form of forming a seed was to do it in a pine cone, in a cone. And I say it's primitive because it takes a long time for a cone to develop. If you ever watched it on pine tree, but it takes a very short time for a flower to form and to be fertilized and to produce a seed, usually also a fruit. And the fruit isn't to feed, the seed is for an animal to eat or take, and then after he eats it, he poops it out, the seeds, and those seeds germinate wherever that occurs. So the fruit is a dispersal mechanism for seeds. So you can see these vascular bundles are along away from the center of the stem, close to the outside surface of the stem. So that would be a dicot feature, so that's true. Now, let's talk about flower petals arrangements. If you have petals in multiples of 3, like 3, 6, 9, etc., you have a monocot plant that's producing that flower. Dicots have petal multiples in 4s or 5s. So we got 1, 2, 3. We got 5 petals on this purple flower, so that is a dicot. 5 is a multiple of 5. On the lily, on the left side, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We got 6 petals in that flower. That'd be a multiple of 3, so that'd be a monocot. Also, we can determine if a plant is dicot or monocot by pulling it up out of the ground and looking at the roots. If the root ball lacks a taproot, there's no central main root, but it's a fibrous ball of roots. Rather than a taproot, we have a monocot system. But if it has a main root, primary root, with secondary roots coming off of it, like a carrot, this flowering plant would be dicot. So if you don't have a main root in the middle, then that would be a monocot. Okay, is this flower a monocot? Okay, recall what we said. Monocots have 3. The petals come in 3s. So in the dicot, the petals come in arrangements of multiples of 4 or 5. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's a dicot flower. So no, it's not a monocot. Well, the flower has 3 petals. So it has to be a monocot by that fact. But if you look at the leaves, I don't know if these are leaves of this flowering plant. It sure looks like they are. The leaves don't have parallel venation. The leaves have, I think, are branching. It looks like they have a branching kind of vein system. So the leaves tell you it's a dicot if those are the leaves of this flower. But the flower is showing that the plant's a monocot because there's 3 multiples of 3 petals. Okay, this has, you might say, no, this has a fibrous, but really we have a taproot right here, a main root. And so this would be dicot. And it would be difficult to count all the petals in there, in the dandelion. But you could look at the leaves and see that the veins are not parallel. Okay, so some plant adaptations. Some plants like radishes and carrots, they store their starch not just in the stem, but in the roots. Some plants have modified leaves, like the spines on a cactus. They're not photosynthetic, they're just protective thorns, so that herbivores won't munch on them. But the stem is photosynthetic. You see the stem is green right there. Some plants have a stem that runs horizontally across the ground and allows the plant to spread out. This is a strawberry plant right there. We call those runners. Okay, structure of a flower. We should know already some of this. No, we should understand what the structures are and what their function is. Okay, so the main thing is the pistils. Oh, you know what the petals are. And the sepals are what covered the flower before. The leaves that covered the flower and protected the bud before it blossomed. Okay, the pistil is the male part of the flower, the male reproductive part of the flower. It contains a sticky stigma. I don't care about the style. That's the filament that connects the stigma to the ovary. The ovary. The ovary is like the base of this face-like looking thing. Inside the ovary are the compartments that contain the eggs called ovules. The ovule will become the seed once the egg is fertilized. And then the ovary thickens and becomes the fruit. Now, we talked about pollination. Pollen hits the stigma. It builds a tube down the style. It finds its way into ovule, and then the nucleus of the pollen grain will fertilize the nucleus of the egg. So the stamen has the powdery end right here. The stamen is the whole thing. It's the male reproductive part of the flower. And the stamen tip, called the anther, produces pollen. The pollen is like the sperm. And the stalk is called a filament, but I don't care about that. The whole thing is called a stamen. Okay. So, seed dispersal. Seed dispersal is made possible by the ovary turning into fruit and the ovules turning into seeds inside the fruit. So what happens, the animal comes along. Some fruits are like hitchhikers. They stick to your socks and then or shirt sleeves, and you have to peel them off and throw them out. Well, that bristly part on the seed is the fruit. Some fruits are good to eat. Birds eat the berries and poop out the seeds. Bears do the same thing. And wherever they poop, they get fertilized by that, and then they got a new place to grow away from the parent plant so that it doesn't compete with the parent. So fruit is a seed dispersal mechanism. Okay, so we talk about life cycles. Life cycle is what your cells do throughout your life. The big picture is this. We make haploid gametes, right, from diploid cells. So it's that simple for us. Now, it's a little more complicated for primitive life forms, believe it or not. But in all life forms, when you go from the diploid cell to the haploid cell, that's called meiosis. When you go from the haploid cell, like over here, haploid cells to the diploid cell. That's called fertilization. So this green half right here in the lighter green half, top half, is the haploid stage. So spores. Now, where do we get that? Now, we don't call the haploid stage for us spores. We go immediately to, animals go immediately to the gamete. That's what meiosis forms in animals, gametes. So we don't really have, the gametophyte stage is like really, really minuscule in animals. In plants, it can be too. In primitive plants, you have a gametophyte stage, though, that before you get gametes, you form spores, which are haploid. And then it develops into an individual that's haploid called a gametophyte. And the gametophyte forms the gametes, the eggs or sperm. But we don't make spores. We go immediately to gametes. But okay, the gametes will fuse and form a zygote, and this zygote grows up, and parts of the zygote our germ cells in our testes or ovaries will undergo meiosis and form gametes again. So this is a cycle, a life cycle. Now, this stage, when you're in the diploid stage, is called the sporophyte phase. And if you're a primitive fungi or algae or a primitive plant, you'll form spores. The sporophyte will form the spores. Okay, so this is really not for animals because we've streamlined it for animals, the life cycle. This is for fungi, algae, and plants. So you need to know those terms. The sporophyte forms spores. The sporophyte is diploid. The spores are haploid. The spores turn into the gametophyte, but after mitosis, after many mitoses, it forms a gametophyte stage. The gametophyte forms the gametes, but since the gametophyte is already haploid, there's no meiosis to make the gametophyte make the gametes. No meiosis occurs because it already occurred here to form the spores right here. Okay, so, and then the rest, the gametes will fuse. That's easy to remember because that's what we do too. The fertilization, it's called fertilization. It becomes diploid, zygote does many mitoses. Some of those cells in a zygote. Well, for a plant, those cells from the zygote are called the sporophyte, and some of those cells will undergo meiosis to form spores, and the cycle continues. Now, if you look at a fern, the fern that you see is the sporophyte stage. Okay, the frond. And on the bottom is 2N, remember? It's going to form spores. So at the bottom you can see these bumps when it's ready to form spores, these dark spots. And just that's where meiosis is occurring, in those dark spots. And it's releasing this very fine powder of spores. Okay, those spores hit moist ground, and they do mitosis, many mitoses to form A gametophyte. This is the baby gametophyte. The gametophyte becomes about as big as, what can I say? I don't know. It's still very small. You can squint at it and see it. It's a heart-shaped thing when it's mature. But the gametophyte will then form either eggs, well, both eggs and sperm. Okay, the egg stays on the gametophyte, and the sperm is released. Hopefully, there's water so that it can swim to the female sex organ. We're not going to worry about the names of these sex organs, and cause a zygote. So fertilization of the sperm and egg forms the 2N stage. The first 2N stage is the zygote. I didn't write it. In the zygote, there's many mitoses and grows into the sporophyte. Okay, so the little sporophyte grows out. There's a sporophyte, and it's growing out of the gametophyte, which is haploid. The sporophyte's 2N because that's the fertilized egg, the zygote growing up. So this is the sporophyte, and he grows into this big fern. And the gametophyte just dies after the sporophyte forms its own roots and all. Okay, so basically that's the application of the alternation of generations. So if we look at a gymnosperm, you get the same thing. It's just a little more complicated, and I don't need you to know all the details of this like you should know for the fern. So the tree that you see is the sporophyte. The sporophyte. The sporophyte forms cones with ovules in the scales. And the meiosis occurs in the cone and forms, in the cone it forms a megaspore, which is female. It really is like the egg. The megaspore turns into the eggs. So anyway, so this is all 2N, right, above the blue line. And all this is N. So meiosis occurred in the pine cone to form the megaspore. And the megaspore divides up and forms the eggs and food for the eggs. And then this also, the pine tree also has these male cones, and you see them all over the place in the spring. And they're spongy like fingers. They're not hard. They don't have to protect anything. So the pollen cone has all kinds of little microsporangium, all kinds of little compartments that the spores form. Okay, but the spores will form in those little compartments in the pollen cones by meiosis. And then the sacs open up. The pollen is airborne. Okay, so that's producing by meiosis the male gametes, and the pollen will be blown into the sticky ovule. You know, pine cones are sticky. with, and then it will very slowly build a pollen tube and fertilize egg and form a seed. So that'd be fertilization. So one of these guys gets together with one of these eggs because it gets blown by the wind, not a pollinator, and that'll form an embryo, and then there'll be a little naked a seed with a little wing. Hopefully that will, it's not a fruit, it will kind of helicopter down and hopefully not be in the shade of the parent tree. And then that that seed will germinate, and the embryo will become, after many mitoses later, a tree, and the whole cycle returns. So these conifers, these gymnosperms, this is a gymnosperm, life cycle, showing the alternations of generations. Okay, so obviously the pine tree is more advanced evolutionarily than the ferns. The ferns were here on the earth well before the pine trees. And pine trees were there well before the flowering plants. So we see a pattern here between, I didn't show you mosses, how mosses, the life cycle is in mosses, but mosses have a very reduced sporophyte stage, and the gametophyte stage is bigger. The sporophyte stage depends more on the gametophyte stage for feeding, for support. But in the primitive plants like mosses, so as we saw in ferns, that's switched around. The gametophyte stage is reduced, and the sporophyte stage, the big green fronds in ferns, that is dominant. As we see in the pine tree, the sporophyte stage is very, very dominant, and the gametophyte stage is microscopic. So we see that as plants advanced evolutionarily, the sporophyte stage becomes super dominant, and the gametophyte stage becomes very reduced and dependent on the sporophyte. In mosses, it's flipped around. The gametophyte stage is the one we see, the green stuff that we see in moss, and the sporophyte stage is just this little thing that comes out and forms the spores, which is reduced. So let's actually show that with a moss. Okay, let's start with what we know, what we see. So the green stuff you see is weird. It's not the obvious sporophyte, it's the obvious gametophyte. So let's start with that. The gametophyte is haploid, okay? And it forms egg and sperm on the tips of the gametophyte. And not by meiosis, because the spore that grew into the gametophyte is already haploid. So you get the egg that stays in there, and the sperm that leaves, and hopefully it's wet. The mosses endure something so that sperm will leave and fertilize the egg. So here we have the male tips right here. And these are little capsules with sperm in them. I don't want to call it pollen, but it's like pollen. And the sperm will, hopefully there's dew, will swim on over to the female tips. Don't worry about their names. And swim into there and fertilize the eggs. Okay, so now once fertilization occurs, we're into the 2N part, the diploid part. And so that diploid part, the zygote, is called the sporophyte. And he will grow, but not so much. He grows into this little thing right here. That's a sporophyte, and it's very highly dependent on the gametophyte. So it's not dominant. It's the gametophyte's dominant in the sense that it's around all the time. It provides for the sporophyte. Without the gametophyte, the sporophyte wouldn't be able to be fed. Okay, so remember just that little cap thing in the stalk that grew out of the female tip of the gametophyte by many mitoses. That is a sporophyte. Meiosis occurs inside that capsule. And this is not sperm, those are spores. And so the spores really are N. So we're back to the N stage. Sporophyte is 2N, right? But meiosis occurs and the spores are haploid. So, again, note how in primitive plants, the gametophyte is the dominant stage. Gametophyte is the haploid stage. And the haploid stage is reduced and dependent heavily on the gametophyte. It flips around in more complex plants that I showed you. The sporophyte, the 2N stage, is by far the more dominant stage, which the gametophyte stage is highly reduced and is dependent heavily on the sporophyte phase. So this is a trend as plants got more advanced evolutionarily. Okay, so I can show you the flowering and angiosperm life cycle, but that's even more complicated because the gametophyte stage is even more reduced. You don't even see it happening. It's all microscopic. The gametophyte stage, the sporophyte stage, obviously is the dominant one for flowering plants. Again, angiosperms, the flowering plants, are by far the most evolutionarily advanced plants. So they're going to show that this trend that I just described.